टाइम होस्टिंग पंकज सर एंड आई एम रियली एक्साइटेड सर से सीखने के लिए। बहुत टाइम से इंतजार कर रहा था मैं सर से बात करने का मौका मिले, मतलब वैसे होता रहता है बट दिस इज अब बैठ के अच्छे से सर से समझने का मौका मिलेगा मुझे कि हाउ डज मार्केट वर्क एंड क्या क्या सोचना पड़ता है, क्या देखना पड़ता है ऑफकोर्स मार्केट में। सो विदाउट टेकिंग एनी मोर टाइम सर, माय फर्स्ट क्वेश्चन इज कि इस वीक निफ्टी में क्या हुआ, क्या लग रहा है, क्या चल रहा है, हाउ डू वी डिकोड दैट?
So hi, good afternoon, Vishu. So I think so. This week has been very volatile for Nifty. With Nifty corrected by 2.5%, and even more volatility we saw in the mid caps and small caps. So they corrected to the tune of 6 odd percent. And we've seen that after touching highs or life highs, market is a bit nervous at 22,000 kind of a levels. And globally also, you don't see much of an event happening. If you look at US markets, except for the top seven stocks, and nothing much is happening. And those seven stocks are determining where the S&P or the Nasdaq is sort of headed. So even if you look at Russell index, there also is largely up about 2%, whereas the S&P is up about 8 odd percent. Now, typically March is a month where we see good amount of volatility, and there are a couple of factors which are sort of driven. One, I think, the warning from the SEBI chief that there is a bit of a froth in the mid caps and small caps. So obviously that did the trick. But I think there are a couple more factors which led to this overall volatility in the market, or the kind of sharp cuts what we've seen. One, I think this is a month where people pay advance tax. So obviously, they have to sort of book profits to sort of pay taxes. Then tax harvesting also happens because in case if you're sitting on short-term losses or sitting on short-term gains, and if you're sitting on some short-term losses, sort of tend to sort of book the losses so that your tax liability sort of goes down. So tax harvesting is another one. Then I think one more factor is that last 6 months we've seen 35% kind of a rally in mid caps and small cap. That is pretty impressive. And historically, we have seen that overall 15 to 20% kind of a correction is very much possible in any given year in the past 10, 15 years, what we have seen. So I think it's a combination of all these factors which led to a cut of nearly 6 odd percent. Now, this correction in mid cap and small cap is still sort of continuing since last week. So overall, we've seen a cut of about 15 odd percent in the small cap and 9% in the sort of mid caps. And our sense is that most of the correction is largely behind us, and hopefully, our sense is that market should bottom out next week.
That's I'm very glad to hear that, sir. My portfolio has been bleeding red and red. Hopefully, thoda green shoots milenge. I'm very glad to hear that. All is well. Sir, this being an election year, I think that would also play a huge role, right? Volatility aspects, mein.
Absolutely. I think if you look at historically, since 2004, election years have been pretty good. On an average, we've got gains of over 20% plus. Now, we've seen that even if you look at last 3, 4 decades, typically 9 out of 11 times the markets have been positive. One more interesting thing is that typically you see volatility in the month of March. And March is the month where the bottom gets made, and from there on, the rally sort of picks up. And hopefully, if the bottom gets made next week, our sense is that largely then the rest of the year is going to be good. I think, except for global factors, most of the domestic macros are still quite good. The corporate earnings were quite okay. Recent inflation numbers were not a worry. And crude oil is still sort of at 83, $84, so not much of a worry for us. Our domestic economy is going to sort of deliver for a 7% kind of a growth rate for 4 consecutive years. So nothing much to complain from India perspective. Globally, yes, there are some challenges. There could be some escalation in conflicts, very much possible. But all said, we are hoping for a good run this year.
Right. सर, एक और क्वेश्चन दैट आई हैड वाज, जिस टाइप का अभी पिछले कुछ वीक्स में हमने देखा है कि ऐसा भारी फॉल इधर से उधर तक आ रहा है, सो इसमें डू यू थिंक इंस्टीट्यूशनल इन्वेस्टर्स और प्रमोटर्स भी कहीं हद तक कुछ उनका रोल हो सकता है?
Absolutely. I think one aspect, if you look at a lot of mutual funds have been sort of struggling to sort of outperform, largely because you look at the universe. You have a large cap universe of 100 stocks, then you have mid cap universe of 150 odd stocks, and then you have a very large base of nearly 3,600 kind of a stocks which are part of the small cap universe. And obviously, a lot of segments, because of low liquidity or low float, the stocks had sort of gone up. And the challenge is that for mutual funds, you're holding 60, 70 stocks. And if the universe is big, some of these stocks do outperform. And usually that leads to sort of what you call underperformance in their respective portfolios. While some of them have looked to sort of increase the quantity of stocks what they hold, but the overall challenge still remains for them. So, which is why if you look at a lot of these mutual funds have been sort of avoiding bulk investment and largely looking at SIP inflows. So that is one. But I think what our sense is that it is a lot to do with the individual stocks also. I mean, we've seen a couple of deals happening here going forward. So, for example, ITC, the BAT sold nearly 4.5% stake, which is the biggest deal which we have seen this year. And you had M&M promoters selling a bit of a stake, and then Indigo also happened. Now, one interesting thing, our sense is that possibly some of these stocks should do well because towards this month and we should see the floats for these stocks sort of getting increased, and in this rebalancing exercise, typically they would get a higher allocation. So I think large caps relatively are looking attractive, whereas mid caps and small caps could take some more time to sort of perform. So you should not expect a V-shaped recovery. But it is wrong to expect that all these small caps belong to the froth category. So I think that is where the differentiation needs to happen. Like I said, it's a fairly large universe, and people track, or we as analyst community track at best 500 or 600 kind of a stocks. So beyond that, a lot of big universes still not tracked.
Right, right. Sir, coming to बैंकिंग सेक्टर आई थिंक काफी ये भी काफी कुछ उधर न्यूज वगैरह आती रही बैंकिंग में टू ऑफ द मोस्ट टॉक्ड अबाउट न्यूज आई थिंक दिस वीक वर वन वाज अराउंड को ब्रांडेड कार्ड्स का आरबीआई का एक मैंडेट आया था एंड देयर वाज समथिंग अबाउट गोल्ड लोन पोर्टफोलियोज में काफी अपहेवल था तो उसके अराउंड कुड यू हेल्प अस अंडरस्टैंड दैट सिनेरियो क्या चल रहा है वहाँ
I think gold loan, if you look at, this has been sort of continuing for the second week. Prior week, we had seen that RBI putting in restrictions on IFL finance. And largely, again, on the perspective that probably the loan to value is something which is what is getting breached as a prescribed norm. And which is why RBI has been very particular, and they've asked all the banks actually to sort of review their gold loan portfolios, because this is one category which has grown fairly well, and it's not a small in size. So it's a fairly large size of 1 lakh crore kind of a overall book which is big there. So I think one obvious perspective would be that for someone say like IFL Finance, since the book is only so their contribution is 1/3 of their book, and if that book sort of gets ramped down, so obviously you will not see growth in the overall book for IFL Finance. And whichever banks, if the overall proportion is high, so that segment is going to sort of take a knock there in terms of growth rate. But luckily for banks, it's not a very sizable portion. But even then, the RBI is sort of wanting banks to sort of turn cautious the way they have turned or made banks to sort of turn cautious on the unsecured lending. So we have seen that. And I think we should take all these news items from a positive perspective, largely because you're making the system even more robust. Even in credit cards, also we've seen good amount of unsecured lending. So obviously, restrictions have been put on Federal Bank and South Indian Bank on the issuance of co-branded credit cards. One obvious impact would be that a credit card is a high margin business, generates good amount of fees, so which is why both the banks would get impacted. But we are more positive on South Indian Bank, given the fact that not only because of this, in this recent correction, we have seen a good amount of stock correcting. So I think you will find opportunities also in this correction, and not like I said, not every bank is a champion gold loan giver. So from that perspective, I think any kind of a mispricing or opportunity should be lapped up.
राइट राइट परफेक्ट एंड सर उसके लिए तो मतलब वी आर ऑलवेज डिपेंडेंट ऑन यू एंड थैंकफुल टू यू आपकी रिसर्च टीम के लिए आपके लिए कि इन दिस वॉलेटिलिटी इन जब ये लीड करता है तो फिर आप वी रिलाई ऑन जस्ट यू टू यू नो सी द लाइट कि कहाँ पे सही है दैट वेयर इज द फ्रॉथ वेयर इट इज नॉट तो माय मतलब हार्टफेल्ट थैंक्स टू यू फॉर दैट एंड योर टीम फॉर दैट एंड विद दैट आई वुड लव टू आस्क इस बार का हिडन जेम क्या रहेगा सर हमारा?
तो देखिए ओवरऑल अगर आप विशु देखेंगे टू व्हीलर एज अ स्पेस काफी अच्छा कर रहा है एंड ऑटो इन जनरल हैज बीन इन द लाइमलाइट सो व्हाट आई वुड वांट टू सॉर्ट ऑफ रेकमेंड इज गेब्रियल इंडिया। सो गेब्रियल इंडिया में जो टारगेट प्राइस है हमारा 440 का है, तो करीब 40% का अपसाइड इसमें मिलेगा। अब ये कंपनी टॉप 10 ग्लोबल शॉक एब्जॉर्बर सप्लायर्स में से है। टू व्हीलर सेगमेंट हो या थ्री व्हीलर सेगमेंट हो या इवन पीवी हो, सो दे बीन सप्लाइंग इवन टू द रेलवेज ऑल्सो. A good part is that on the two-wheeler segment, they have been able to increase their market share from 25 to 32%. In PV, they have maintained their share to about 24-25%. But when you look at UV segment, now UV is the highest growing segment within the entire PV as a space, and their market share there is about 35%. And which is why I feel that this company should do well, given the fact most of the pockets where this company operates are sort of doing very well. And good part is that balance sheet is clean. You have 300 crores kind of a cash on the books. We are expecting about 20% CAGR kind of a growth in earnings. The stock has witnessed a good correction, and which is why I feel that the upside potential looks good with a target price of 440.
Awesome, awesome. Like they say, best time to buy is when there's blood on the streets. So I think
Absolutely.
right. This was amazing, sir. Thank you so much for taking out time for us. I hope you'll allow us next week. फिर से आएंगे weekly wrap में समझेंगे कि क्या हुआ. And thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, Vishnu.
Subscribe to our YouTube channel and click on the bell icon to never miss an update from ICICI Direct.